What if the most famous royal baby photo of the modern era wasn't what it appeared to be? Not wrong in a dramatic way, not fake in the way rumors usually mean fake, just off, quietly, persistently off. Because sometimes the most unsettling stories don't begin with an accusation. They begin with a hesitation, a pause. A professional who did their job, filed the image, moved on, and then years later, can't quite let go of the feeling that something in the frame never settled properly. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This story matters now because it isn't being driven by anonymous accounts, message boards, or retroactive speculation. It's being pulled back into focus by someone whose entire career depended on accuracy, access, and restraint. Someone who was there. Someone who pressed the shutter. Someone who, until very recently, said nothing. Arthur Edwards has photographed monarchs, heirs, weddings, funerals, births, the full sweep of modern royal history. He's not known for drama. He's known for reliability. Editors trust his eye because his eye has never chased scandal. He documents what is placed in front of him, and then he moves on. Which is why his name surfacing in connection with the Archie Harrison Photocall lands differently. Not louder. Heavier. This isn't about proving anything. Not yet. It's about understanding why a moment long treated as settled history is suddenly being re-examined, and why the unease around that image never fully disappeared inside the very group of professionals who were there to record it. Ask yourself something simple before we go any further. Have you ever looked back at a moment you thought you understood and realized you'd ignored a detail because acknowledging it would have complicated everything? Not because it was explosive, but because it didn't fit cleanly into the story you were being handed. That's the space we're in now. At the time, the photocall was meant to signal normalcy. A modern royal couple, a brief appearance, a controlled reveal. A baby introduced not to the world, but to the cameras that would carry the image outward. Nothing unprecedented, nothing controversial, just another carefully managed royal milestone.
Not because the public demanded answers, not because social media forced a narrative, but because a man who has spent decades photographing royalty, often at their most vulnerable moments, has begun to reflect on what his camera captured and what his instincts flagged. Instincts he ignored at the time. Instincts he trusted himself not to interrogate. Because in that world, questioning appearances can cost you access. And access is everything. So why now? Why risk credibility? Why risk backlash? Why risk being misunderstood? Those questions are just as important as the allegation itself, maybe more so. Because when someone known for restraint finally speaks, it's rarely impulsive. It's cumulative. It's the result of years of thinking, replaying, and realizing that silence, too, has consequences. Let's rewind for a moment. Think back to that day. The setting was deliberately modest. No hospital steps. No extended press line. No lingering shots. Just a controlled indoor appearance. A carefully chosen backdrop. A handful of photographers. A very short window. That alone was not unusual. Different couples choose different approaches. But what was unusual, subtly, quietly, was how much control existed over something traditionally treated as communal and symbolic. And here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Because photographers notice things the rest of us don't. They notice weight distribution. They notice grip tension. They notice how an object responds, or doesn't. When shifted, they notice because they have to. Because missing details is how you miss the shot. And one photographer, standing there that day, noticed something that didn't align with expectation. Not enough to stop the event. Not enough to cause a scene. Not enough to say anything, then. Just enough to register. And that's the kind of detail that lingers. Especially when it contradicts everything you're supposed to be seeing. Now, let me ask you something directly. Have you ever experienced a moment where everything looked normal, but felt slightly off? Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just inconsistent. And you dismissed it. Because dismissing it was easier than explaining it. That's the psychological space this story occupies. Not certainty. Not chaos. But doubt. And doubt is dangerous. Not because it proves anything, but because it invites questions that don't go away. For years, this moment sat untouched. The images were archived. The footage replayed on anniversaries. The public memory settled into something fixed and unquestioned. And that's important, because once a moment hardens into memory, it becomes immune to scrutiny. We remember how we were told to remember it. We stop looking closely, until someone who was there looks again, and sees it differently. What makes this situation even more complex is who is doing the looking. This is not an online commentator, not a YouTube analyst, not a late-arriving critic piecing things together from afar. This is someone who was physically present, standing feet away, watching not just through a lens, but with trained perception. Someone whose career depended on not misreading moments. Someone whose silence carried weight. Which raises another uncomfortable question. If he noticed something then, why didn't he say anything? The answer isn't glamorous. It's professional survival. Royal photography is not about capturing scandals. It's about trust, about knowing where to stand, when to shoot, and when to look away. You don't challenge appearances unless you're certain. And even then, you hesitate. Because once you speak, you don't get to step back. And certainty, in this case, was never immediate. It was delayed. It formed slowly, over years, as memory collided with reflection, as footage was revisited, as other inconsistencies surfaced, as questions once considered impolite became unavoidable. And that's the tension running beneath this entire story. Not what happened, but why does it still bother someone who had every reason to forget it? This is not about proving a claim in isolation. It's about pattern recognition, about how moments designed to be fleeting can become focal points when examined with time and distance, and about how controlled narratives rely on one thing above all else: compliance. Compliance from the press, compliance from the public, compliance from memory itself. So when that compliance fractures, even slightly, the entire structure feels unstable. Right now, what's emerging is not a declaration. It's a re-examination, a quiet revisiting of posture, movement, and physical response that didn't match expectation. And yes, there is a specific allegation circulating, one that sounds so bizarre, so implausible, that it's easy to dismiss outright. That's part of why it's so effective as a distraction. Because when something sounds ridiculous, we stop listening. But serious investigations don't begin by laughing something away. They begin by asking, why is this being said now? By whom? And at what cost? Those questions matter more than the claim itself. Because false stories usually seek attention. This one seems to avoid it. It's being discussed cautiously, reluctantly, almost uncomfortably. And that alone should make us pause. Especially when the person involved has spent a lifetime avoiding controversy. Which brings us back to the present moment. To why this story is resurfacing now and not earlier. Because timing, in journalism, is never accidental. Something has shifted, not publicly yet, but perceptually, enough for someone to feel that silence is no longer the safer option. And that's what makes this story matter. Not because it proves deception, but because it suggests unresolved truth. And unresolved truth has a way of surfacing when narratives grow too rigid to sustain it. In the next section, we're going to talk about the man at the center of this renewed scrutiny. Not the couple, not the child, but the photographer, his career, his reputation, and why his perspective carries weight that internet speculation never could. Because once you understand who he is and what he spent decades protecting, you begin to understand why this single moment refuses to stay buried. And why what he noticed may be far more important than what he said. There are people who photograph royalty, and then there are people who are trusted by it. That distinction matters, because one implies access, the other implies longevity. And longevity, in royal circles, is never accidental. The man at the center of this chapter didn't arrive on the scene chasing spectacle. He didn't build a reputation by provoking reactions or pushing boundaries. He built it by doing something far less glamorous and far more difficult. He learned when not to shoot. That's the first thing people misunderstand about elite royal photographers. The job isn't just about pressing a button. It's about restraint, about knowing when to lift the camera and when to lower it, about earning the confidence of people who live their entire lives under observation. And that's why the name Arthur Edwards carries a different kind of weight. Not because he's famous, but because he's trusted. Decades of trust. He's been there for births, for funerals, for weddings that changed dynasties and moments that quietly redefined them. He has photographed joy and grief from the same respectful distance, year after year, without crossing the invisible line that separates documentation from intrusion. That line is everything. Cross it once, and you're done. Which is why what he's doing now, what he's allowing himself to say out loud, even cautiously, deserves attention, not dismissal. To understand why, you have to understand how people like him operate. They don't speculate publicly. They don't editorialize their work. They don't revisit old assignments looking for drama. Their currency is credibility. And credibility is preserved by silence. For most of his career, Arthur Edwards embodied that principle. He photographed what he was permitted to photograph, delivered his images, and moved on. He let the pictures speak. He did not narrate them with hindsight. He did not reinterpret moments years later to fit shifting public moods. Until now. And that alone should slow us down. Because when someone whose professional identity is built on non-interference begins to interfere, even slightly, it's rarely impulsive. It's considered. Let's talk about the environment he came up in. Royal photography isn't like other beats. There's no room for freelancing instincts or personal branding. You're operating within a tightly choreographed ecosystem, one where every movement is logged, every presence noted, every breach remembered. You don't ask uncomfortable questions. You don't challenge optics. You document what's presented. And if something feels odd, you file it away internally. That's the unspoken rule. So when Arthur Edwards stood in that room during the Archie photocall, he wasn't there to interrogate reality. He was there to record it. And he did. But recording something doesn't mean understanding it in the moment, especially when you're trained not to overinterpret. Photographers like him are taught to trust the frame, not their feelings. To rely on what's visible, measurable, reproducible. And yet, there are moments when your body notices something before your brain allows it to form language. A micro-hesitation, a pause, a sense that an object isn't responding the way experience tells you it should. Those instincts don't shout. They whisper. And when you're standing in a room full of colleagues, officials, and expectation, whispers are easy to ignore. That's what makes this story complicated. Because nothing dramatic happened that day. No confrontation. No objection. No whispered comments exchanged between photographers. Just a brief appearance. A few shots. And then it was over. But some moments don't end when the doors close. They linger. Especially when you've spent decades around newborns, around parents holding infants, around the unpredictable physics of living weight. Experience creates a baseline. Deviation from that baseline doesn't announce itself. It unsettles. Arthur Edwards didn't leave that photocall thinking he had witnessed deception. That's important. He left thinking something didn't quite align. And then he did what professionals in his position always do. He moved on. Because questioning that moment would have required questioning everything around it. The protocols, the permissions, the assumptions shared by everyone in that room. And challenging shared assumptions inside royal coverage is career suicide. So the instinct stayed buried. For years. Until something else happened. Not one thing, but several. Small, cumulative moments that began to pull at the thread he had tucked away. A lack of follow-up imagery. A shift in access patterns. An absence that felt louder the longer it persisted. And slowly, quietly, the memory resurfaced. Not as certainty, as curiosity. And curiosity, when paired with experience, can be dangerous. Here's what often gets overlooked in stories like this. Silence is not the same as ignorance. When someone stays quiet, it doesn't mean they saw nothing. It often means they saw something they didn't know how, or whether, to process publicly. Arthur Edwards spent a lifetime learning when silence protected truth rather than obscured it. But that calculation can change, especially when silence starts to feel complicit. Let me ask you something. If you noticed something subtle, ambiguous, and potentially explosive at work, something that didn't rise to the level of proof but refused to disappear from your mind, what would you do? Speak immediately and risk everything? Or wait, hoping clarity would arrive later? Most people wait. That's human, and that waiting period can stretch into years. The trouble is, clarity doesn't always arrive with time. Sometimes time does the opposite. It sharpens the memory. It strips away the noise of circumstance. And when you look back, you realize what you dismissed wasn't confusion, it was caution. Arthur Edwards' caution defined his career, which is why his willingness to revisit this moment now feels so significant. He's not presenting himself as a whistleblower. He's not issuing accusations. He's reflecting. And reflection from someone like him is not idle. It's weighted. It carries the implication that what was once set aside can no longer be ignored. That's what we're dealing with here. Not a man seeking attention. A man reconciling his instincts with his principles. And that reconciliation doesn't happen overnight. It happens when patterns emerge. When one isolated moment begins to connect with others. When the cost of silence starts to outweigh the risk of speaking, carefully, deliberately, without theatrics. That's why the renewed focus on his perspective matters more than any single claim circulating online. Because claims are cheap. Experience is not. And Arthur Edwards' experience tells us one thing above all else. He knows what normal looks like. He's photographed normal hundreds of times. Which is why when something deviates from normal, even slightly, it leaves an imprint. That imprint doesn't fade. It waits. Until the moment feels right to acknowledge it. Now, here's the part that complicates everything. Even now, he's not saying what people want him to say. He's not drawing conclusions. He's not labeling the moment. He's describing a feeling, an observation, a sense that something didn't behave as expected. And in investigative journalism, those are often the most dangerous words because they don't resolve anything. They open doors. They invite scrutiny. They force us to revisit what we thought we understood. And once that process begins, it rarely stays contained. Because if one respected professional begins to question a moment that was once accepted without hesitation, others may start to re-examine their own silence. Not publicly, at first. Internally. An internal reevaluation is how narratives unravel. Slowly, quietly, without spectacle. That's why this chapter matters. Not because it proves anything, but because it establishes the credibility of doubt. Doubt rooted in experience, not imagination. Doubt voiced by someone who spent a lifetime avoiding it. Because stories like this don't live in abstractions. They live in spaces, in layouts, in who is allowed to stand where, for how long, and under what conditions. And when you examine those conditions closely, something becomes harder to dismiss. Let's start with what normally happens. For decades, royal baby photocalls followed a familiar rhythm. Different eras, different monarchs, but the same underlying logic. Visibility mattered. Not spectacle, visibility. The public didn't need intimacy, but it needed continuity. A sense that this moment fit into a larger, shared story. That's why hospital steps became symbolic. That's why multiple angles were permitted. That's why photographers were given enough time to capture not just an image, but movement. Movement matters more than people realize. Because movement is unscriptable. You can choreograph a pose. You can control a backdrop. You can manage lighting and positioning. But you can't choreograph how a living infant shifts, settles, reacts. Which is why photographers pay attention not just to how something looks, but how it behaves. Now contrast that with this photocall. It was brief. Almost aggressively brief. There was no lingering. No easing into the moment. No allowance for natural adjustment. The couple appeared, stood, smiled, answered a small number of questions, and exited. And that alone wouldn't raise alarms if it weren't paired with something else. Control. The level of control exercised over this appearance wasn't just high. It was comprehensive. Who was invited? Where they stood? What angles were permitted? How long cameras were raised? Everything was predefined. Again, control itself is not suspicious. Royal appearances are controlled by definition. What's unusual is when control tightens around moments that traditionally allow a little looseness. And newborn photocalls have always been one of those moments. Because unpredictability humanizes the institution. A baby fusses. A parent adjusts. A hand shifts instinctively. Those micro moments reassure the audience that what they're seeing is real, not rehearsed. And in this case, those moments were conspicuously absent. Not missing, restricted. Photographers were kept at a distance that limited depth perception. The window was narrow. The framing was guided.